All right, guys. Hey, this is Dave, and I'm here to show you how to do some creative poses and draw dynamic characters using Spider-Man as our main figure for this drawing for right now. So what I'm doing is I'm going to start going into Sketchbook Pro and just start drawing out some really loose sketches of how I want my character to possibly look. Some things I'm trying to think of while I'm drawing out these poses is just kind of how Spidey might move. He definitely moves a lot different than a lot of other heroes. So he's someone that you can have a lot of fun with while you're trying to come up with the different pose ideas for the character for the final drawing. It's really, really important to make sure to always start out with some gesture poses. Just helps you stay really loose, get nice fluid characters, and also you don't want to waste a lot of time on one drawing and one pose and get halfway through that drawing, put a lot of time into it and realize that you don't like it, the pose isn't working, the character doesn't look right. So it's really important to have a nice map of your ideas on the page before you start really fleshing anything out. I'm also trying to make sure that while I'm drawing out my poses that I'm not making anything too stiff. I want a lot of curves, I want a lot of action into the poses, bending the spine whenever I can, crooking an arm here or there wherever I can, and just making sure that it moves nice. You don't want any stiffness, especially with a character like Spidey, who's always moving. Sometimes I like to think of him, even in a static drawing, as if I were to be animating him, really stretching him as far as I can when he's jumping or moving or in action. And if he's landing or if he's coming in for a landing or if the pose calls for it, really even squashing him so that we just get a lot of range of motion with this character. He's really fun to play with, really easy to work with. So essentially, I'll draw out anywhere from 6 thumbnails to 10 to 20, just depending on what I want the pose to look like. And so, so that's one way to start laying out some of your designs, your thumbnails, your little quick renders for the character. If you find that you're not getting the smoothness that you want with your characters, one thing I always like to do is just take a big, thick pen tool, don't use the pencil, and just really start getting very loose, sketching out this character, seeing how just quickly I can jot down the idea of this pose. So you can see here I'm using a marker tool instead of a pencil tool. Sometimes the pencil tool, because it's so thin and precise, it also stiffens your drawings up. So if you find that your drawings are really stiff, then start using a bigger tool to sketch out your initial drawings. And still here, I'm trying to make sure I keep everything flowing really nicely and looking good. You can see I've really bent that spine there as I'm working. And here I'm going to just start sketching in the actual details of his body and his anatomy and refine the drawing a little bit more. While I'm drawing with the pencil now and trying to make sure that he's keeping this pose. It's very easy for a very nice drawing and a really nice loose thumbnail to stiffen up instantly the second you start going in and refining the pose. So I'm staying very conscious the whole time I'm drawing that the pose still stays nice and fluid. I still keep my curves. It doesn't stiffen up. So still stay loose with your pencil while you're at this stage. Don't start thinking too much about anatomy and those things, just keep thinking about keeping that pose, keeping the fluidity of that pose. Also, I'm only putting a few little areas of his costume in first. Most of the costume elements should come towards the end. Get your pose down first, get the character drawn out the way you want it, fix those little issues that you might have with how the drawing's moving before you really start focusing too much on all the webbing on his costume and all the little costume elements that make up his costume. And with Spider-Man, there are a lot of great costume elements. There's a lot of fun stuff to play with there. And all that webbing that he has in his eyes. Some people come from the school of thought that his eyes are sewn onto his mask, and so they stay the same no matter what. Other people will have fun with it and just move the eyes to show expression, even though they're sewn on the mask. It's just a little creative license you can take while you're drawing out this character. I also really like to use his webbing in his hands to show movement. That gives a lot more expression to the character. It shows you what direction he's swinging. And anytime I get a chance to draw any sort of webbing or material on a character or anything that something might be flowing off of them, I really like to play that up into the motion of the character. Really helps with how the whole drawing moves. So now I'm just going to go in and start putting in costume elements. The webbing on his fingers wraps around, so it's a little different than some of the other parts of his webbing on his costume. But the best part about Spider-Man's webbing, and this is where you can also get really expressive with it, is you can use it to show the contours of his muscles. And so it takes even a flat drawing. You can put this webbing onto the costume and immediately it gets a little bit more of a three-dimensional look. So it's really fun to play around with that webbing on his costume. So here I'm just sort of finishing up the costume elements on him and finishing up any little details I want to put in. I'm still trying to work really quick, trying to work loosely, and the main goal is always to make sure that original pose doesn't stiffen up. Some tools you can use to help you with that are to just draw a nice line of action through the character. You can see I'm doing that here. And you can see that he keeps that nice curved line throughout, from his back through his head. And even his legs are on the same curved line. And those curved lines give you a lot of help you out when you're drawing your characters, just to keep this nice curved look, this flowing look, like he's really swinging through the air and that he's got momentum building up. And so you want to make sure there's no straight lines. Keep everything nice and curvy. When you're drawing, you can also, when you're done, make a nice little bounding box around him. And I like to sometimes just put a straight line through that bounding box and just see if he lines up with it. If he lines up with it, I might twist the drawing around a little bit more. I might tweak something here, throw one of his arms out a little bit further, crook one of his legs a little bit, just so he's not following that straight line. And also, make sure that you always draw Spider-Man's hands on the correct way before you start actually finalizing anything with ink or color. Spider-Man has some pretty amazing powers, but both of his hands are always on the right way. So just make sure of those little things too. So here I am just finalizing that and making sure that everything looks good on my pencils. Now the pencils are still a little loose. They're not completely tight because I want to be able to take those pencils into Photoshop. And you can see here I'm going to set up my brush. These are the settings for my inking brush. You can find some nice brushes to download online. You can create your own. Photoshop's got a few nice brushes to work with when you're inking, but for the most part, I suggest either custom brush or find something nice online that you like, and play around with the different brushes that you have are available to you uh, online. You can get them at DeviantArt and stuff like that. Lots of people create brushes and put them up for free for people to use. So one of the reasons why I left my pencils nice and loose is because um, I don't I don't want to basically just have a finished pencil drawing and bring it into the ink stage and then just trace the drawing. Um, Part of keeping that nice dynamic action and that nice fluid figure is having a little fun with the inks too. If you just end up retracing something that you already kind of finalized with your pencil, you limit yourself a lot when it comes to the inking stage. You definitely want to have something there for yourself to be able to ink over, but at the same time, don't make it so tight that you can't improvise a little bit with the brush. Also, I'm trying to make sure to think about my line weights while I'm drawing, while I'm inking Spider-Man. So certain times I'll take my inking brush and make a nice, real thick line where there might be a shadow or on the bottom of his arms, the bottom of his legs, sometimes around the bottom of his jaw, just to add a little bit more weight to the drawing. I like to definitely make sure all my lines are nice and varied in there. And you can see with the digital inking, I work pretty quick, and I make a lot of lines. Command Z always if I don't like the line, and just keep working. So sometimes I'll draw a line once or twice, maybe 3 or 4 times, and I'll just kind of keep deleting and redrawing until I really get that line that I like. Something that looks really nice, complements the pencils underneath. But once again, we're not restricted to just the pencils underneath. Sometimes when you're inking, you get into this rhythm, and with that rhythm, you can improvise with your inks a little bit and get an even better drawing than what you originally had penciled out. So the ink should always be a part of the drawing. It shouldn't be just a something you're kind of quickly adding to the drawing. You want to add more to the drawing than just it now being black lines. So while I'm finishing up inking here, I'm inking in Photoshop, and I'm working on a Wacom Intuos tablet. It's really good. I usually set the tablet up off to the side, and pressure sensitivity is great. Works really well with Photoshop. Works really well with Sketchbook Pro, which is what I was using to do the pencils. And you can see here that I've been using the same brush throughout the whole drawing, and I'm able to get a lot of varied line weight throughout. Yeah, that pressure sensitivity on that brush is just great. It's awesome for getting these nice thick to thin lines, little thin feathery lines, or just really a nice bold thick line at the bottom of of his legs. So I'll start putting in some of his costume details. Still trying to make sure that I work pretty quick. You can see I'm still going in and putting a little bit of line in that's not there in the pencils, and there's not a whole lot of thought process behind it. It's sort of just letting the drawing happen, and that'll guarantee that you won't stiffen up your drawing even in the ink stage, which is very possible. A lot of times you have these really nice fluid pencils. You've worked your way past not stiffening the drawing up. When you start refining the drawing more, and then you work your way into the inks, and next thing you know, that whole drawing just doesn't have that same movement to it. So I like to work nice and quick with my inks. The webbing sections on Spider-Man wrap around his body, so you can use curved lines throughout based on what part of his body the lines, the webbing is on. And just finishing up some costume details and going in, putting a little bit of line weight in on the bottom of his hands and his fingers there. With his fingers folded over, it's going to put a little bit of a shadow on his wrist there, on his palm. So just kind of going in and making some of these lines, fixing some of these lines up a little bit so that they're not all the same weight. They vary a bit. Erasing bits so that we have a nice thick to thin line on him. And then the webbing. Right here, I'm not even worried about tracing over the exact lines I put down for my pencils. This is where I can really play up that motion and just have a nice loose ink line. If you hold shift on your keyboard while you're drawing a line, it'll keep the line straight. So if you want a nice straight line over and over and over again, hold shift down on your keyboard and you'll get that nice crisp thin line for his webbing there. And they're just really improvising with it, not worried about anything in particular with the webbing, just making sure it looks nice and spindly. So there's the inks. When I start coloring, I'm going to go into channels. And in channels, I'm going to load selection, which is that little circle that looks like dots. Go back to my layers and create a new layer. And on that layer, I'm going to add a layer mask, which is that square with the circle. And the layer above it, I'm going to create a new layer. Then I'm going to hold the Alt key and click between the layers. And I'll fill the layer, the ink layer, on here it's layer 3, with black and hide my original inks. So that way when I start to color Spider-Man, after I've done coloring Spider-Man, I can actually also color the line weight around him. I can make a color hold around any part of him that I want. So I'm going to go in and just start blocking in some colors. I'm tracing out some of the main costume details on him with the lasso tool and then just filling it. I really like to use desaturated colors when I'm coloring. I don't like anything too bright and glaring. So here you can even see that the blue on his costume is almost gray. It's got a little bit of a blue tint to it, but I think it'll work nice with the red. So flats is what I'm putting in right now. I'm not worried about shading anything or highlighting anything. I'm just making sure that he's colored in the way I want. I'm using a mid-tone of what I'll eventually put down. I can use a darker version for the shadows, and if I want to do highlights, I'll use a lighter version of that red or that blue-gray later. But with the flats, just trying to make sure that there's no background color showing through or that everything lines up with the lines. And then here I'm just taking another brush. You can see the settings here for it. Sometimes I'll use a lasso and I'll trace out the shape of my shadows. Other times I'll keep it a little bit looser. So since we're really concerned right now with this video about making sure that it's a dynamic pose and it's a nice fluid pose, something really interesting, I'm going to use a brush to shade with that's not so precise. And I'm kind of just playing around with it at this point and just putting in a little bit of shadow on the side of his face. You can see that this brush kind of makes a real scratchy sort of texture. And when shading, I'm shading on a top layer above my flats. The layer's set to multiply. And then I basically just take a dark desaturated color, and in this case I'm using kind of a grayish purple for the shadow, and I'm putting that onto the multiply layer. And you can see that that affects the colors, the red and the dark gray, differently. And then here I'm going in onto my color holds layer, layer 3, and just giving him a nice red line all the way around. And my favorite part, putting in the webbing, coloring in the webbing with the white. Oh man, just adds that extra little detail. Perfect. Now, I also like to put, sometimes when I've got these blank backgrounds, I like to just put a little bit of an interesting shape in. So here I'm just taking a lighter version of the background color and just varying the size of my brush. I turn the brush into an oval shape, so I'm just going and putting in some little interesting shapes down at the bottom. Just something to fill up that area. And then if I want to put a texture in, I'm going to find a texture online. You can find them everywhere. Type in texture on Google. Bring it in to my drawing. I can copy and paste it right on top in a new layer. I'm going to drag it to fit over that entire layer onto my entire piece. And once I've got it set in place, I'm going to set that layer to multiply. And on multiply, that's going to give the drawing a nice texture. You can lower the opacity if you want, if the texture is too harsh, but right here it looks to work nicely for me, so I'm going to leave it just as that. And that's it, guys. That's Spider-Man. That's dynamic poses. Thank you.